Hi, my name's Dr Adam Booth and welcome to another locked down edition of Quantum Source. Now, this morning I'm in Buckwood on the western outskirts of Leeds and I'm stood in the middle of an archaeological site. Now, admittedly, it's a pretty subtle archaeological site and you have to get your archaeological eyes in, but when you do that, you find that there are various carved stones, there were artefacts that were found that suggest that this is a pre-Roman site of occupation, and maybe even that occupation goes further back into prehistory than even that. Now, the reason we're talking archaeology today is that you wouldn't know it because it's an absolutely miserable morning, but we're almost at midsummer. We're almost at the summer solstice. And of course, one of the classic images of the summer solstice is the sun rising between the stones of Stonehenge. And so with everybody being in lockdown, I saw online that there were various agencies that were going to do a live stream of the solstice from Stonehenge. So this is our own little tribute to the solstice. So today's speaker is Dr Jim Leary. He is an archaeologist in the Department of Archaeology at the University of York. And what Jim would say is that actually, although the stars and the sun and the moon and all the sort of celestial bodies were obviously important to Neolithic people, you can also learn a lot about their practices from the landscape and the features that you find in the ground beneath your feet. And so in a few minutes, when I get back home and dry, we're going to be giving Jim a quick call and getting the lowdown on that. The recommended source for this, well, if you are going to be getting up early in the morning to watch the solstice on Midsummer's Day, then you're going to need an eye-opener. So either the strongest coffee that you can find, obviously sunrise will happen at 4 in the morning, if you can actually see it. And another classic eye-opener is, of course, a Bloody Mary, so you choose. I'm going to go back home, I'm going to get warm and dry, and we'll give Jim a call. Cheers. And hello, Jim, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you very much. Yeah, not bad.
Yeah, good. It's how's lockdown working out for you?
Well, I've become a lot more hairy.
Likewise.
Yeah, but I quite like it. I'm in a fantastic location in the North York Moors, and so I'm very, very privileged.
Cool. But then, as a field archaeologist, maybe you're not being as active as you might like to be, unless you're digging up your garden and looking for stuff.
Well, I live in an old quarry, and there used to be it was a limestone quarry, and there used to be a lime kiln so I love gardening, and I've been taking out all my digging sort of frenzy on the garden, but I've found evidence for our kiln and some fantastic pottery. So kind of I feel like I'm keeping in touch with my digging side.
All right, cool. So it's science in action right in your back garden.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool.
So, all right, let's say that we were leaving artifacts now for future generations to find, a reminder of lockdown. What source would you be putting in there?
Okay, now, Adam, I'm not sure you're going to allow this. I would like the source of the River Kennet. Is that possible?
I think I'm starting to detect the hint of a perfect quantum source pun coming up here.
Well, it will come up later on in the talk, right. You see. So
okay. Now, it would be difficult to bottle that one up, right? So we've got to bottle something else there.
Okay, so fair enough. I didn't think you'd let it go. So what I have brought with me is this fabulous beer from the Cropton Brewery. This one's the Yorkshire Moors.
Right.
Now, the brewery is literally 2 fields over there. So at the beginning of lockdown, I just headed, in a straight line across hedges over fields, and got myself just beeline straight for it. And I got myself 4 boxes, which I'm working my way through. And I live in the North York Moors, as I say, so the North York Moors are just literally there. Yeah. So for me, this is my go-to drink.
All right, cool. Well, local knowledge, local breweries, really cool. So you were talking about these kind of excavations that you've been doing in your back garden, but obviously you've been doing excavations much more widespread than that, and you've got some thoughts that whilst we all associate the solstice with Neolithic visions of the sun rising and things like that, you'd suggest that maybe there's as much you can learn from kind of the landscape beneath your feet. You don't have to look into space, you could just look on the ground around you.
That's right. Yeah, that's
Cool.
what I'll be talking about.
Right. Let's share your screen then and take a listen to that.
Okay, so I will be talking about the Neolithic and specifically the later Neolithic period and the natural world, the landscape around them. And when we talk about the later Neolithic, we're talking about a period that extends from about 3000 BC through to about 2500. So it's about a 500-year period.
Okay.
Okay, and of course this is the period where loads of our really famous monuments were constructed. The one I have on the screen here is a photograph by the wonderful Adam Stamford, and it's an iconic image of an iconic monument, Stonehenge, which is not a monument I really want to talk about very much because it gets lots and lots of airtime, quite frankly. So I'll be rapidly moving on. But you asked me to talk, presumably, because this weekend will be the summer solstice.
That's right.
And I know when the summer solstice is every year because my oldest daughter, was born on the 21st of June. She's a solstice baby, so destined to either become a archaeologist or a hippie or something anyway. But so every year she delights in the fact that her birthday is on the longest day, which of course is what the summer solstice is about. And we know in the later Neolithic period that they were very interested in solstices, both the summer solstice, which falls around, as I say, the 21st or sometimes the 20th of June each year, and the winter solstice, which is around about the 21st of December each year. So the two endpoints. One is the longest day and the shortest night, and in the winter it's the shortest day and the longest night. And then, of course, in between the solstices, we have the equinoxes. And Stonehenge encapsulates this later Neolithic, I don't know what the word is it obsession or is it delight in the celestial bodies? They are certainly looking up and are marking and observing various points in the year. Now, the Neolithic are Stone Age people. Stone Age, they're not using metals at this point, but they are farming. And of course, farmers are interested fundamentally in particular seasons and observe and mark the seasons as they progress through the year. So clearly the Neolithic people were interested in that. Stonehenge is a great example, actually, because it marks the summer solstice quite clearly, probably actually marks the winter solstice much more. So when we all celebrate the summer solstice at Stonehenge, actually the winter solstice is probably the bigger of the two, right, certainly based on the evidence, but it also marks the equinoxes, and it also there's some evidence that it marks the lunar standstill as well. So the sort of the moon solstice, if you like. So they're certainly observing the skies, and it's much more than just a calendar to mark the point in the year. It's from the evidence that we have, it's clearly a way of gathering people together, a form of celebration. Probably all sorts of rites were played out at these particular points in the year, and grievances addressed, and alliances made, perhaps marriage alliances, or however you might imagine it. And we certainly know that they're feasting at particular times of the year, marked by these solstices. So it's an important point in the year for gathering people together. Now, just whilst I've got this photograph up here, can you see my cursor?
Yes, we can, yeah.
I'm just running the cursor along the Stonehenge Avenue, and this is on the solstice axis, both the midwinter and the summer solstice. Depending on which direction you're standing in. Yeah. And as you can see, it's marked by two banks, one on each side. Okay, clearly marking the solstice alignment. We're going to come back to that later on. Now, Stonehenge isn't the only monument, although sometimes when you look at the English Heritage website, you'd believe that there is no other monument in the entire world but Stonehenge. Actually, there's amazing stone circles and henge monuments up and down the country. Stonehenge is a complex one, but just one of them, and not, in my view, necessarily my favourite. Other monuments mark the solstice. Longmeg and her daughters, Castlerig, both up in Cumbria, quite clearly mark solstice alignments. And there are other big monuments like the Thornborough Henges, which may mark astronomical points and alignments. And from a slightly earlier period, actually, we have Newgrange, Passage Tomb in Ireland, just north of Dublin, and Maze How up in the Orkneys, another passage tomb. Again, both of these mark solstitial alignments. Newgrange is absolutely, well, they're both absolutely wonderful. I mean, really, really wonderful monuments to go and visit. Newgrange, you can see, because they, if you go, there's a sort of visitor centre and you get a whole display and the light being shone through what was a light box. And so there's finger of light coming along the passage and then lighting up the back wall. Clearly, these are important, possibly, very likely sacred religious moments, points in the year. Highly exclusive, one should point out as well. Now, just coming back to Stonehenge again, and that Stonehenge Avenue, what's really fascinating was that when it was excavated a few years ago, and you can see this trench right across the avenue. So this is the avenue we were looking at earlier here, and you can see the excavated trench. Well, here are the two banks on either side, and they're not humanly constructed at all. They're entirely natural features. In fact, they seem to be some feature from a past glaciation, a distant glaciation, so sort of periglacial activity. And within these two natural banks, these two natural humps, are a series of grooves. These are periglacial stripes, and they're sort of gullies that are formed perfectly naturally, but just in this area, and just by some coincidence on the solstice alignment. So this clearly shows the reason why Stonehenge is where it is, because it's on this entirely natural and coincidental solstitial alignment. Okay, but it also tells us that as well as looking up to the skyscapes, our Neolithic builders were also looking down to the ground, and they knew the ground intimately. They knew the geology, the topography, the form of it, rivers and springs and so on, and all of these things form part of their worldview. So I'm not reducing the value of the skyscape element. That was clearly important and also formed part of their worldview, but it's the stuff below the ground, as you say, that I'm more interested in. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to then just move on from Stonehenge into to talk about a couple of sites that I've been working on, not too far from Stonehenge, and bring out some of these themes.
Sure, yeah.
Now one of them is Marden Henge. And you can see on this map, we have Stonehenge to the south. We have Avebury, another really famous stone circle just to the north. And in between these two is the Vale of Pewsey. And in the middle of the Vale of Pewsey, we have Marden Henge. Now, it's probably worth at this point me just saying what a henge is, because there's an awful lot of confusion around this. And the confusion is entirely the fault of archaeologists. It's quite ridiculous, really. And I've said this so many times that I don't think that anyone who isn't an archaeologist working in this area probably still won't get it, because we've seriously managed to screw up. But a henge is a bank and ditch enclosure. And what's unusual about it is that the ditch is on the inside of the bank, so not on the outside, which is what we would normally expect. When you look at enclosures through time, whether it's an Iron Age hill fort or a Civil War defence that's been thrown up, the ditch is on the outside. That's to defend things and people and whatever on the inside from anything that might attack it on the outside.
Yeah, okay. And you give yourself a firing line when you're stood on the higher ground that you make, and all the other enemy soldiers have got to climb up the bank to get to you.
Exactly.
Right.
But henges are an inversion of that. The ditch is on the inside. So from a defensive point of view, it doesn't work, right?
Right. Yeah.
So we've thought really long and hard about why this might be. And before I go on, actually, I should just mention that we get the word henge from Stonehenge. But it turns out that Stonehenge isn't actually, by our own definition, a henge. Okay, so this is where the confusion comes in. So people often think a henge is a stone circle. It's not. You do sometimes get stone circles within henges. Avebury is a great example of that. But you also get stone circles away from henges and in different areas too. And you also get timber circles as well, which sometimes are in henges and sometimes they aren't. But a henge is very specifically that bank and that earthen bank and ditch, and the ditch is on the inside.
I think you've clarified very well there how the confusion arises.
Yeah. So anyway, on behalf of all archaeologists, since basically the 1930s, when the mistake happened, I apologise profusely. We could have picked a better word for it. Anyway. And I should say that Stonehenge isn't a henge, because although it does have a bank and a ditch, it's the wrong way round for us, for under our modern eyes, to be classified as a henge. So anyway, people have thought really long and hard about why did people put the ditch on the inside of the bank or the bank on the outside of the ditch? What was the point of doing this? It's not defensive at all. Well, some people have said actually it's a deliberate inversion to be friendly and welcoming, i.e., come to our henge. This is open. This is not defending us from you. You're welcome in, which may well be the truth. Or, and I quite like this idea, it is defensive, but it's defending the people on the outside from something that's inherently powerful or dangerous that exists on the inside.
Okay.
So, whichever theory you want to go for, and there are reams and reams, entire books written about this, but pays your money and take your pick, and there we go. But I quite like the latter of the two ideas. Okay, so we excavated at Marden. Marden is a huge henge monument. It encloses something like 11 hectares. It's something like half a kilometre from the bottom to the top.
Wow.
So it's really vast. These along here are all houses, so you can see how big it is. And it's not circular, which is quite unusual. I mean, henge monuments are generally circular. It's not. It's quite angular. We get quite a strong sense, actually, that these ditches were dug in at slightly different times and possibly by slightly different people as well, because they don't always quite meet up. And what's odd about it is that the whole southern side is open, so there is no bank and ditch along this side. Instead, the River Avon, which rises just slightly to the north in a place called Alton Priors, which means first waters. Wonderful place. You can see it bubbling up out of the water. It's like the water's boiling because it's constantly bubbling. It's coming out. Anyway, it bubbles up there, and the River Avon swings around in a big meander, and the scarp of that river forms the southern side of our henge. Okay, so once again, and we'll come back to this, we're getting this sense that they're using the landscape in particular ways. Rather than using the landscape, they're embellishing the landscape. They're adding to it. These monuments develop up, they evolve up from the ground itself. They're not architecture imposed from above. Okay, now within Marden Henge, there are a couple of interesting features. One of them was a mound. It's now gone. We won't be talking about that, but there is this circular feature you can see here, and this is another henge monument. So it's a henge within a henge.
Okay.
Now we excavated on the north side of this inner henge. We keep calling it, when we were excavating there, we came across a patch of chalk, which, as we sort of cleaned it up and excavated further, resolved itself into a rectangle of chalk. And by this stage, we were thinking this is looking very much like a house floor. And indeed, eventually, we did uncover a complete Neolithic building floor. So this is I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. It's spine-tinglingly amazing. But this is the chalk surface of a Neolithic building. It dates to around something like 2450 BC. What's unusual about it is the central square is sunken down into the ground to give this kind of double level effect, and then right in the middle of that sunken area is a hearth, a fireplace. Okay, so this wonderful overhead view of it shows the square or the rectangular floor, the square sunken area, and then the circular red hearth. It's burnt, it's fired bright red, sort of salmon pink red. And you can see 4 post holes around it, which evidently held some sort of structure over the fireplace. And actually, we found the post holes for the building itself. And I've just marked them out in this photograph with stones. And you can see that it's a round house with a rectangular white chalk floor, and then a sunken area, and then a circular hearth. And if you can say one thing about the late Neolithic people in Britain, is that they love their geometry. They love their squares and circles. And here we've got a circle in a square in a circle kind of thing. We see these patternations in their pottery and in their rock art and so on and so on. So anyway, this is just the most mind-blowingly wonderful discovery. This is this is a house which presumably people lived in, or some sort of function happened in. And it's not the only one, I should say. Similar houses have been excavated at a henge not too far away at Durrington Walls, but not quite as big as this. And what's really wonderful is we've got these spreads of what we term middens, in other words, just rubbish dumps, kind of emanating out from this house. This is their filth. This is their dirt. This is the stuff that is chucked out. Really, absolutely packed full of animal bone. Nearly all of the animal bone is pig, and there's quite a number of pigs represented here, mostly seemingly brought in as joints of meat rather than herded in live. But the bone has clearly been singed in places, so it's been cooked, and it's covered in little fine flint tool cut marks, so it's clearly been butchered and eaten. So this is clear evidence for feasting. And what really surprised us about this midden was that it's not actually a kitchen midden that's built up over time. It seems to be a single deposit with lots of articulating bits of bone, and it's very well preserved. So I think this quite clearly is feasting activity going on.
Because are you saying that if it was sort of progressive built-up use, then there'd be bones from like lots of different years in there, and they wouldn't necessarily fit together, but you could almost reconstruct an entire few pigs from that or something? Oh
yeah, I mean, so in this example, in this photograph, you can see articulating backbones, the vertebrae there. And if it had been built up over time, you'd expect that not to be so well preserved as this. You also would expect rodent gnawing and maybe some dog gnawing going on, and so on and so on. And we just simply don't get that. So I think it's fair to say this is a single deposition, one massive feast. Okay, absolutely packed full of pottery and other wonderful things, the sorts of things that so rarely survive in the archaeological record. So this is, again, wonderful. Cool. The other really wonderful thing is that the surface of the building had a little fine layer of dirt, just sort of a millimetre or so thick, or a couple of millimetres in places thick. And that's literally the dirt that's been brought in on people's feet and walked around the building. Yeah. So we really have gone to town in analysing this. We're looking at, and this is ongoing work, so I'm afraid I've got no real conclusions for you. But we're looking at sort of chemical traces to see if we can get movement around the building and activity areas and so on and so on. And what you can see here is that we're sampling that layer across the house floor at a really, really fine detail. And what we're hoping to do is look at the chemical traces to see if we can pick up people's movement around the building and activity areas and that sort of thing.
Cool. And so each of those little white things is a little plastic bag with a soil sample in or something?
Exactly.
Right,
exactly.
Okay.
and then they were taken away from site and analysed.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, just as a small aside, we reconstructed the building at a much smaller scale, as you can see here on campus at the University of Reading with my colleague Martin Bell. And he did all sorts of things, cooking on it and boiling things and steaming things. We even used it as a sweat lodge at one point. And then it was re-excavated. And the idea is to look at these various tasks and compare them to what we actually found in the field to see if we can help hone what was going on in this particular building.
Yeah,
so this is all ongoing work.
And that's kind of like the experimental archaeology. So like, you know, if you find out that if you burn certain bits of wood, then you don't get that chemical deposited. So you can rule out that particular practice or something like that.
Exactly. You know, we're talking about a period that's really quite remote, and we're talking about somewhere that's 4,500 years old, and we need to use every single tool in the toolbox to try and base what we're saying on some degree of evidence, so that we're not just, you know, making it up. And so that's what we're trying to do here, is to use, you know, do something really practical to try and understand actually what the archaeological record is.
Yeah, and if it creates some like cool photographs as well, then yeah, it's
exactly. And it's an awful lot of fun, I tell you as well. So now going back to the actual archaeology on site, the building, we had some amazing artifacts from around there. We had these two beautiful arrowheads. There's one of them here just after it was found in the ground. Now, what was truly amazing was, I mean, this is incredibly well-made arrowhead, but it clearly had one tail that had snapped here. Now, the amazing thing was that a few years later, we were excavating not too far away, and we found the tail. And we went to, these are now on display in the Wiltshire Museum in Devizes. And so we drove to the museum and refitted the tail, and it fitted perfectly. This is what the arrow looks like. Absolutely stunning. Now, all of this was filmed, and there's a nice little bit of YouTube footage showing the discovery of the tail and then the refitting it and stuff. Well worth a watch.
Cool.
I mentioned pottery. The pottery that was used on this site was a type of pottery known as grooved ware. This is a pottery type that was found up and down the country. Actually seems to originate from up in the Orkneys, but is found all over the country. And again, you can see this late Neolithic love of geometry, you know, triangles and chevrons and diamond shapes and so on. What I really enjoyed was some of these sherds of pottery. In fact, it looks like it's a complete pot, had what looked like a white slip on it. Now, when we analysed that white slip under the scanning electron microscope, we were able to show that the slip was actually bone ash. And quite clearly what they had done was cremate some bone, grind it up, and then apply it to this pot in a very thin, fine way to create this white wash. Now, we don't know whether this bone is animal bone or human bone, but you know, I think I would lay money on it being human. I think this is some kind of ancestral pot. You know, rather than having Granny in the pot, this is Granny on the pot.
Okay, so it's right. So it's not just sort of cremation urn. It's actually using someone's ashes in the manufacture of a pottery item. Exactly.
So it would have been applied when the pot was probably leather hard, but before it had been fired. So it's part of the production of the pot.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, just there's so many parts of this site that were just so mind-bogglingly wonderful.
Yeah.
You know, really are. Now, other things that we found around this building include, you know, pins and needles, mostly made of bone, and these are most likely to be clothing pins and maybe hair pins as well, body ornaments. We also found other buildings, so that wasn't the only one. That was the best preserved, but here we've got a sort of D-shaped building with post holes there and then a beam slot along one edge. But what's really interesting, and you can see that in this photo, that this building is overlain by the Henge bank. And the same is true of the really well-preserved building we just discussed. That was also preserved underneath the bank of that inner henge. And so quite clearly, we had what we are now realizing, a pretty large late Neolithic settlement that existed across this area. Something's happened, who knows what. The whole thing's been razed to the ground, and a henge has been built over the top. The henge is actually the final form, is the final part of the phase, is the final phase of this monument.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I wonder whether something happened within this settlement. You know, was there, I don't know, maybe this is the you know, our current situation that's making me think like this, but was there some kind of plague or pandemic that meant the settlement was razed to the ground, and then for some reason it needed to be henged, if that could be used as a verb. You know, the world needs to be protected from this old settlement, or maybe the settlement was simply commemorated within this henge.
Okay.
Either way, the henge is clearly the final part of it.
Mm.
Now, just going back to the point of this discussion, was we also excavated other areas, other parts of the henge bank. And in this area, we were excavating over the southern part of the inner henge bank, and we found that actually there was no bank at all, that this part of the henge was just like the Stonehenge avenues, made up of an entirely natural periglacial feature. So this bank existed before anything else. It was just a natural feature in the landscape. They simply enhanced it when they built the bank around it. Yeah. And again, it really gives us this strong sense that these monuments are not plonked onto the landscape, but they develop up out of the landscape. In a sense, they're simply enhancements of the landscape. And it gives us this idea that, again, the topography, the soil types, these are really important to these late Neolithic people. Allied with all of that was this, again, going back to this wonderful LiDAR image again of Marden, which shows that the River Avon forms that southern side. So again, another natural feature forming part of the henge. And we know that there are a number of springs actually inside Marden Henge. So geology, water, you know, soil, rocks, water, sky, all of these things are important. Now, this is very similar to some of the things I found at another monument not far away. This is just to the north, and this is Silbury Hill. This is, again, a wonderful monument, 31 meters high. It's the largest prehistoric earthen mound in Europe, absolutely vast. And back in 2007 and 8, I led a team of archaeologists into the centre of this hill. We reopened an older tunnel into it as part of a conservation project. And here you can see the work going on there. But what we found within the hill itself, I throw this slide in because I love it. This is a younger version of me giving a lecture to Sir David Attenborough.
Wow!
To visit. I know. It's sorry, it's gratuitous, but I just had to put it in there.
I think you've got to do it. If you've given a lecture to David Attenborough, you have to name drop that one.
Yeah, and I can tell you, he is the nicest person I've ever met. He was warm and friendly and listened carefully, and then he had some great stories of his own, which he told me. So
awesome. Well, big up, Sir David.
Now, people often ask me, so what did you find in Silbury Hill? They often expect me to say, well, you know, it was the grandest burial we've ever seen in prehistoric Europe. But we didn't. There was no burial. And, you know, we were in a large part of the central part of Silbury Hill. Actually, what Silbury Hill seems to be, amongst many other things, is a celebration of soil and rocks and geology. All these things we've been discussing, all piled up, and actually, and in some places, it's almost a playful or certainly symbolic use of different coloured soils, one against the other. here's the very back of the tunnel, and you can just see these are basket loads of material piled up over the top, gravels, chalks, but topsoil and subsoil and more organic material, all just piled up into this great big heap. Within this, we get wonderfully preserved environmental remains, or organic remains, the sorts of things, again, that should never really, or don't really ever preserve from Neolithic sites. This is a turf, and you can actually see that it's blades of grass still retaining their green colour, absolutely phenomenal, and insects too.
Wow.
I know, it's just, so this is a Neolithic insect. So this has given us an amazing snapshot of what life, what the environment in the late Neolithic period looked like. And we can see that they're bringing material from not necessarily very far, but from the landscape, and they're piling it up and creating this huge heap, almost this, in a sense, this huge celebration of the soil beneath our feet. And again, like Marden, Silbury Hill has is surrounded by springs, the most famous of which are the Swallowhead Springs. This is a photo of the Swallowhead Springs, which are still highly revered. Well, I say still, it's a relatively new ceremony which started in the 60s, where people tie ribbons and put all sorts of offerings around, particularly this cracked willow which sits just over the spring. But essentially this is the source of the River Kennet. Okay? So that's my link to the beginning.
Right. Okay.
Silbury Hill sits right at the very head of the River Kennet. The River Kennet and the River Thames are the same river, and would certainly have been seen as the same river in the Neolithic period, so which then goes out into the North Sea. Silbury Hill sits at the head of that. Marden Henge, as I mentioned before, sits at the head of the River Avon, which then goes out into the English Channel at Hengetsbury Head. So these monuments and the rivers are integrally linked together. We know that Durrington Walls, which is just downstream of Marden Henge, has an avenue, a gravel avenue that links it to the river. And then, of course, we've got the famous avenue, which we discussed right at the beginning, at Stonehenge, which links the river to the monument, or the monument to the river. So they're all wrapped up in the world around it. And this is the point that I'd like to really emphasize here, is that although the skyscapes are important, it's the landscapes which are also important. And in fact, this is in the late Neolithic period. And in fact, it's probably the mixing of them both. In fact, you could argue that these late Neolithic monuments sit at the join between the upper realm, the skies, the realm that we walk on, and the below realm. You know, it sort of mixes these three elements together. And it brings the landscape together in essentially an axis mundi, you know, this sort of center of the earth. And so I think these late Neolithic monuments, be them henge monuments, stone circles, mounds like Silbury Hill, were essentially considered axis mundi. So they were considered as the center of the earth for those people. And I think that's the true importance. They're places where the sacred light from the summer solstice or the midwinter sunset strikes the monuments. They're the point that the rivers come out of the ground. They're the points that they're the point where natural topographical features, which themselves probably had stories and myths and legends of how they were formed, swirling around them. All of these materials were mixed together, and at some monuments, say Stonehenge, for example, we know that stones are being brought from Wales and from the Marlborough Downs, and we know this from other stone circles. Stone is being brought from a variety of locations, and this is the location they all come together in a single monument. And I think that's the true importance of the late Neolithic monuments.
Cool.
And with that, I end my short offering to Quantum Source.
Well, thank you very much, Jim. It was fantastic. I did have a couple of questions. The first was that, to some extent, I guess, when you explain things the way you do, it suddenly becomes common sense that it wouldn't just be the sun and the sky and the stars that mean a lot to these kind of farming communities. If they are farmers, then they're aware of the need for water, the need for decent soil. And so, yeah, it really does seem to come together.
Absolutely, and they understood what was below the ground. I mean, these people dug ditches, and places like Avebury, the ditch is vast. I mean, it's absolutely vast. They really intimately knew their geology, and you're quite right. I mean, they lived in this landscape. They were completely encapsulated by this landscape. They needed to know it intimately.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was a real life or death situation. The other one was, I guess I was struck by the spread through the British Isles of some of these aligned monuments. And is that like a series of coincidences that take place over thousands of years? Or do we think that there was real communication between all these communities?
There's quite clearly communication between them. In recent years, archaeologists have emphasised the importance of Stonehenge and people coming to it, but that I have to say is a very Stonehenge-centric point of view.
Right.
Actually, what we can see is people moving around the landscape a lot, and we're getting a much greater sense of this through modern technologies, particularly isotope analysis, which looks at the isotope in particularly teeth. Which preserves the geological source, or to some extent at least, the broad geological area people were being brought up on compared to where they're being buried. And so
you're born somewhere where there's a chalk soil, and you die somewhere where there's a granite soil, or something like that.
Exactly, or vice versa. And so we can see that the people themselves are moving a long way. We can see movement of animals. We can see movement of cattle, particularly around the country. But we can also see it culturally as well. And we can see, for example, there are some patterns of decoration on pottery at Marden that's only found in Ireland, for example. So I think there is a really strong sense that people are moving around. Now, ironically, at this point in prehistory, it looks like we're quite insular as well. And so we're not actually having an awful lot of contact, based on the evidence we have, with the continent. In the earlier Neolithic, lots of contact. In the Bronze Age, by the time we start getting the first beaker people, huge amounts of contact with Europe. But we have this sort of weird little insular period where people are moving around a lot around the British Isles, but not necessarily any further.
It's amazing how a weird little insular period comes back to bite you in the ass 2,000 years later.
It is. I will refrain from describing it as the first Brexit. I can't tell you how many headlines I've seen saying the first Brexit. The loss of Doggerland, the first Brexit.
Right.
The Paleolithic, the first Brexit. And this was nothing like Brexit. Brexit is a modern day hideous storm that we're all having to deal with right now. But yeah, it was a strange period, but a wonderful period that developed some incredible art and some incredible monuments. Now, why they were creating those monuments? Well, that's something that we're really sort of working hard on. And I think excavations like the ones I've described are helping us get there. But clearly, there's some sort of impetus. There's a drive there, whether that's a religious drive or a ceremonial drive, or whether and as we're getting more refined chronologies, we're beginning to realise that the Bronze Age. That beginning of the Bronze Age, the first beaker people coming across, that was clearly happening at pretty much the same point. So are some of these really big monuments actually sort of an indigenous insular response to a perceived threat?
Yeah, saying, look, we own this place, right? This
it's the sort of thing you do. If you're pootling along quite happily, actually you don't leave huge marks on the landscape, because it's only when actually you feel slightly threatened that you start, well, this is ours, this is what we do, and that's when you get this sort of flourish of big monuments, big statements. It's in a sense it's willy waggling.
Yeah. Neolithic willy waggling, nice one. I tell you what's really great as well is though that for all the fact that we've got Stonehenge and things like that, you can still get spine-tinglingly excited about digging through a waste heap. So that's really cool. Yeah. Well, I hope you can get out to the waste heaps before too long, Jim, and carry on the good work. But with that, I think we'll wrap it up. You might have seen that Jim had his Twitter address at the end of his presentation there. So if you've got any questions, do give him a shout, and I'm sure he'll be happy to get back to you. Otherwise, post them on the Quantum Source Twitter account, and I can relay them to Jim. But with that, Jim, we'll say thank you very much for your talk, and we'll see you around. Nice one. You enjoy, mate. You take it easy.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
See you in a bit. Bye-bye now.
So there you go. You've got soils, you've got source, you've got solstices, and you've even got a hint at some ancient lockdown mysteries. So thanks very much to Jim for that talk. Enjoy the solstice. Enjoy it while you can, because that's it. Halfway through summer, nights are starting to draw in now, so please don't get too depressed. To try and cheer you up and keep you educated and entertained, do keep your eyes on the Quantum Source Twitter and Instagram feeds. We will be posting more videos to keep you educated and entertained during this lockdown period. Just remains for me to say that I've been Dr. Adam Booth. This has been Quantum Source. You've been great. Stay cool.